Hi class, today we're going to be reading The Life of Pi. So you're going to need to turn your textbook to page 202, and we're going to first learn about the author. The author, Yann Martel, was born in 1963. He was born in Spain to Canadian parents and lived in many different places, including Costa Rica, Mexico, Alaska, and Canada. After graduating from college, he worked various jobs, such as a dishwasher and security guard. Unsure about what he wanted to pursue as a career, he started to write. Though he found critical success, sales of his stories did not follow. Eventually, Martel traveled to India, where he found the inspiration for his most successful work, The Life of Pi. So, we are going to read an excerpt from this novel, Life of Pi. You also may have heard of the movie called Life of Pi, but this book, the novel, is the main character is a teenager whose family owns a zoo in India. The family decides to leave India with their animals and sail to Canada. But while traveling, their ship is struck by a violent storm and sinks. Pi escapes on a lifeboat with 4 of the family's animals, a hyena, a zebra, an orangutan, and a Bengal tiger named Richard Parker. The hyena kills the zebra and the orangutan, but is in turn killed by the tiger. Pi constructs a raft for himself where he can retreat to safety from the tiger and sets about taming Richard Parker. So Life of Pi is another example of physical survival. This is kind of a fantastical tale, this idea of someone being stranded on the ocean in a lifeboat with a tiger. And Pi's biggest problem is not a lack of food, but a lack of food to feed the tiger. Because as soon as the tiger gets hungry, the tiger is going to eat the sweet little succulent child who is Pi, who is on this lifeboat. Because the tiger's not going to want to jump in the water because he knows he'll drown. And Pi doesn't want to jump in the water and swim away because he knows he'll drown. So he has to figure out how he can get the tiger to not eat him while they're stranded at sea. So it's not bad enough that he's stranded at sea. Now he has to worry about a tiger eating him. And this is the story. It's pretty great. I love this story, just like I love the Shackleton story. Chapter 61. The next morning, I was not too wet, and I was feeling strong. I thought this was remarkable considering the strain I was under and how little I had eaten in the last several days. It was a fine day. I decided to try my hand at fishing for the first time in my life. After a breakfast of 3 biscuits and 1 can of water, I read what the survival manual had to say on the subject. The first problem arose: bait. I thought about it. Okay, before we turn the page, I do want you to underline this part where he is going to try fishing for the first time in his life. So he has no real experience of survival, so he has to learn as he goes. And the first problem is that he needs bait. In order to catch fish, you need bait to bait the fish. There were the dead animals, but stealing food from under a tiger's nose was a proposition I was not up to. So the tiger had killed, well, I guess the hyena had killed the zebra and the orangutan, and then the tiger killed the hyena, and then the tiger gets to eat all the meat that's left over. So survival of the fittest, I guess. He would not realize that it was an investment that would bring him an excellent return. I decided to use my leather shoe. I had only 1 left. The other I had lost when the ship sank. I crept up to the lifeboat and I gathered from the locker one of the fishing kits, the knife, and a bucket for my catch. Richard Parker was lying on his side. His tail jumped to life when I was at the bow, but his head did not lift. I left the raft out. I attached a hook to a wire leader, which I tied to a line. I added some lead weights. I picked 3 that had an intriguing torpedo shape. I removed my shoe and cut it into pieces. It was hard work. The leather was tough. I carefully worked the hook into a flat piece of hide, not through it, but into it, so that the point of the hook was hidden. I let the line deep down. There had been so many fish the previous evening that I expected easy success. Now, it's probably not clear how Pi is in relation to the tiger. So there's a lifeboat with the tiger on board. I don't know how to draw a tiger. So there's a tiger on board this lifeboat. But then Pi has made like a raft for himself. So he has this long line and he has tied it to this little piece of, I guess something that's floating, a little raft that he was able to make. And Pi is on this raft, and that's where he's trying to fish. So he tries not to go to the lifeboat. He instead stays on this raft because the tiger has kind of taken over the life raft, and that's his domain. So Pi stays on the raft, hoping the tiger won't jump off the lifeboat and try to eat him. And then he kind of pulls his way onto the lifeboat when he needs to get food, because there are stores of food, because it's a survival boat, and when he needs to get like his survival gear, and the life raft just happens to have a fishing kit on it. So he tries to fish with his shoe, but he didn't have success. I had none. The whole shoe disappeared bit by bit. Slight tug on the line by slight tug on the line. Happy freeloading fish by happy freeloading fish. Bare hook by bare hook, until I was left with only the rubber sole and the shoelace. When the shoelace proved an unconvincing earthworm, out of sheer exasperation, I tried the sole, all of it. It was not a good idea. I felt a slight promising tug, and then the line was unexpectedly light. All I pulled in was line. I'd lost the whole tackle. This loss did not strike me as a terrible blow. There were other hooks, leader wires, and weights in the kit, besides a whole other kit, and I wasn't even fishing for myself. I had plenty of food in store. Still, a part of my mind, the one that says what we don't want to hear, rebuked me. Stupidity has a price. You should show more care and wisdom next time. So let's underline this. So this is a key to survival. Be smart. Later that morning, a second turtle appeared. It came right up to the raft. It could have reached up and bit my bottom if it had wanted to. When it turned, I reached for its hind flipper, but as soon as I touched it, I recoiled in horror. The turtle swam away. So he's just kind of fearful. Like he could have grabbed that turtle, but he hesitated and he was fearful. The same part of my mind that had rebuked me over my fishing fiasco scolded me again. What exactly do you intend to feed that tiger of yours? How much longer do you think he'll last on 3 dead animals? Do I need to remind you that tigers are not carrion eaters? Granted, when he's on his last legs, he probably won't lift his nose that much. But don't you think that before he submits to eating puffy, putrefied zebra, he'll try the fresh, juicy Indian boy just a short dip away? And how are we doing with the water situation? You know how tigers get impatient with thirst. Have you smelled his breath recently? It's pretty awful. That's a bad sign. Perhaps you're hoping that he'll lap up the Pacific and in quenching his thirst, allow you to walk to America? Quite amazing, this limited capacity to excrete salt that Sundarabian tigers have developed. Comes from living in a tidal mangrove forest, I suppose. but it is a limited capacity. Don't they say that drinking too much saline water makes a man-eater of a tiger? Oh, look, speak of the devil. There he is. He's yawning. My, what an enormous pink cave. Look at those long yellow stalactites and stalagmites. Maybe today you'll get a chance to visit. So he's looking at the tiger and looking at his huge teeth and saying, oh, maybe today's the day that the teeth will eat me. Richard Parker's tongue, the size and color of a rubber hot water bottle, retreated and his mouth closed. He swallowed. I spent the rest of my day worrying myself sick. So, Pi had to feed the tiger, so the tiger wouldn't eat him. I stayed away from the lifeboat. Despite my own dire predictions, Richard Parker passed the time calmly enough. He still had water from the rainfall, and he didn't seem too concerned with hunger. But he did make various tiger noises, growls and moans and the like, and did nothing to put me at ease. The riddle seemed irresolvable. To fish, I needed bait, but I would have bait only once I had fished. What was I supposed to do? Use one of my toes? Cut off one of my ears? So he could not figure out how to solve this problem. So he's worrying himself sick and he has this problem that he needed bait, but he didn't know how to solve it. A solution appeared in the late afternoon and in a most unexpected way. I'd pulled myself up to the lifeboat. More than that, I'd climbed aboard and was rummaging through the locker, fervently looking for an idea that would save my life. So he was in the locker, rummaging through the locker, looking for an idea that would save his life. So he isn't giving up. He's still having hope, and he's still looking for things that can help him. I had tied the raft so that it was about 6 feet from the boat. I fancied that with a jump and a pull at a loose knot, I could save myself from Richard Parker. Desperation had pushed me to take such a risk. Finding nothing, no bait, and no new idea, I sat up, only to discover that I was dead center in the focus of his stare. He was at the other end of the lifeboat, where the zebra used to be. I turned my way and sitting up, looking as if he'd been patiently waiting for me to notice him. How was it that I hadn't heard him stir? What delusion was I under that I thought I could outwit him? Suddenly, I was hit hard across the face. I cried and closed my eyes. With feline speed, he had leapt across the lifeboat and struck me. I was to have my face clawed off. This was the gruesome way I was to die. The pain was so severe I felt nothing. Blessed be shock. Blessed be the part of us that protects us from too much pain and sorrow. At the heart of life is a fuse box. I whimpered, "Go ahead, Richard Parker, finish me off. But please, what you must do, do it quickly. A blown fuse should not be over-tested." He was taking his time. He was at my feet making noises. No doubt he had discovered the locker and its riches. I fearfully opened an eye. It was a fish. There was a fish in the locker. It was flopping about like a fish out of water. It was about 15 inches long and it had wings. A flying fish? Slim and dark gray-blue with dry featherless wings and round, unblinking, yellowish eyes. It was this flying fish that had struck me across the face, not Richard Parker. He was still 15 feet away, no doubt wondering what I was going on about. But he had seen the fish. I could read a keen curiosity on his face. He seemed about ready to investigate. So Pi thought that Richard Parker had attacked him when this fish hit him in the face, but instead it was a flying fish, and Richard Parker was just looking at the fish and trying to figure out what it was. I bent down, picked up the fish, and threw it towards him. This was the way to tame him. Where a rat had gone, a flying fish would follow. Unfortunately, the flying fish flew. In midair, just ahead of Richard Parker's mouth, the fish swerved and dropped into the water. It happened with lightning speed. Richard Parker turned his head and snapped its mouth, jowls flapping, but the fish was too quick for him. He looked astonished and displeased. He turned to me again. "Where's my treat?" his face seemed to inquire. Fear and sadness gripped me. I turned with the half-hearted, half-abandoned hope that I could jump onto the raft before he could jump onto me. So he's thinking he could throw the fish at him and he could tame him. So I bent down, picked up the fish, and threw it towards him. This was a way to tame him. However, as soon as he was excited about this idea of being able to tame Richard Parker, the flying fish flew. Sorry, I can't pay attention that way. And it hit his mouth and flew into the water. So now Richard Parker was not able to get that fish. And now he's like, "Where's my fish, little boy?" But then, paragraph 17, at that precise instant, there was a vibration in the air, and we were struck by a school of flying fish. They came like a swarm of locusts. It was not only their numbers, there was also something insect-like about the clicking, whirring sound of their wings. They burst out of the water, dozens of them at a time, some of them flick-flacking over 100 yards through the air. Many dived into the water just before the boat. A number sailed clear over it. Some crashed into its side, sounding like firecrackers going off. Several lucky ones returned to the water after a bounce on the tarpaulin. Others, less fortunate, fell directly into the boat, where they started a racket of flapping and flailing and splashing. And still others flew right into us. Standing unprotected as I was, I felt I was living the martyrdom of St. Sebastian. Every fish that hit me was like an arrow entering my flesh. I clutched at a blanket to protect myself, while also trying to catch some of the fish. I received cuts and bruises all over my body. So he was attacked by a school of flying fish. Pretty crazy, huh? The reason for this onslaught became evident immediately. Dorados were leaping out of the water in hot pursuit of them. So Dorados are larger fish, and Dorados are chasing the little flying fish. So you have the big Dorados that are chasing these little smaller flying fish. And that's why all these flying fish are jumping out of the water and going into the boat. And that's kind of what you're going to see. I'm going to show you what Dorados and flying fish look like, but that's kind of somewhat what they look like. Dorados have more of a rounded head to them. Kind of looks now like goldfish, like the kind you eat, the little crackers. Okay, the reason for this onslaught became evident immediately. Dorados were leaping out of the water in hot pursuit of them. The much larger Dorados couldn't match their flying, but they were faster swimmers, and their short lunges were very powerful. They could overtake flying fish if they were just behind them and lunging from the water at the same time and in the same direction. There were sharks too. They also leapt out of the water, not so cleanly, but with devastating consequence for some Dorados. So in addition to the Dorados, you had larger sharks behind the Dorados trying to eat the Dorados and jump at the Dorados. So it's kind of like the chain of, like the little fish gets eaten by the big fish, which gets eaten by the bigger fish. So all of these fish are jumping out of the water, and the Dorados are trying to eat the flying fish, and the sharks are trying to eat the Dorados. This aquatic mayhem didn't last long, but while it did, the sea bubbled and boiled, fish jumped, and jaws worked hard. Richard Parker was tougher than I was in the face of these fish, and far more efficient. He raised himself and went about blocking, swiping, and biting all the fish he could. Many were eaten live and whole, struggling wings beating in his mouth. It was a dazzling display of might and speed. Actually, it was not so much the speed that was impressive as the pure animal confidence, the total absorption in the moment. Such a mix of ease and concentration, such a being in the present, would be the envy of the highest yogis. When it was over, the result, besides a very sore body for me, was 6 flying fish in the locker and a much greater number in the lifeboat. I hurriedly wrapped a fish in a blanket, gathered a hatchet, and made for the raft. I proceeded with great deliberation. The loss of my tackle that morning had had a sobering effect on me. I couldn't allow myself another mistake. I unwrapped the fish carefully, keeping a hand pressed down on it, fully aware that it would try to jump away to save itself. The closer the fish was to appearing, the more afraid and disgusted I became. Its head came into sight. So Pi is afraid of this fish. The way I was holding it, it looked like a scoop of loathsome fish ice cream sticking out of a wool blanket cone. The thing was gasping for water, its mouth and gills opening and closing slowly. I could feel it pushing with its wings against my hand. I turned the bucket over and brought its head against the bottom. I took hold of the hatchet. I raised it in the air. Several times I started bringing the hatchet down, but I couldn't complete the action. Such sentimentalism may seem ridiculous considering what I had witnessed in the last days, but those were deeds of others, of predatory animals. I suppose I was partially responsible for the rat's death, but I'd only thrown it. It was Richard Parker who had killed it. A lifetime of peaceful vegetarianism stood between me and the willful beheading of a fish. I want you to make note of this line here. So the reason why Pi is having such a hard time killing this flying fish is that he's never killed an animal before. He's never even eaten animal flesh. He has spent his whole entire life a vegetarian. So Pi has never killed or eaten an animal before, so struggles with killing the fish. And always pause the video if I go too fast. I covered the fish's head with the blanket and turned the hatchet around. Again, my hand wavered in the air. The idea of beating a soft, living head with a hammer was simply too much. I put the hatchet down. I would break its neck, sight unseen, I decided. I wrapped the fish tightly in the blanket. With both hands, I started bending it. The more I pressed, the more the fish struggled. I imagined what it would feel like if I were wrapped in a blanket and someone were trying to break my neck. I was appalled. I gave up a number of times, yet I knew it had to be done, and the longer I waited, the longer the fish's suffering would go on. Tears flowing down my cheeks, I egged myself on until I heard a cracking sound and I no longer felt any life fighting in my hands. I pulled back the folds of the blanket. The flying fish was dead. It was split open and bloody on one side of its head at the level of the gills. I wept heartily over this poor little deceased soul. It was the first sentient being I had ever killed. Sentient means a being with a soul, a being capable of feeling. I was now a killer. I was now as guilty as Cain. I was 16 years old, a harmless boy, bookish and religious, and now I had blood on my hands. It's a terrible burden to carry. All sentient life is sacred. I never forget to include this fish in my prayers. So this one little fish, it may seem like not such a big deal to kill one little fish, but to this 16-year-old boy, it was a huge deal. It went against his religion. It went against his feelings that all life is sacred. And even to this day, he never forgets to pray for this one little fish that he killed. After that, it was easier. Now that it was dead, the flying fish looked like fish I had seen in the markets of Pondicherry. It was something else, something outside the essential scheme of creation. I chopped it up into pieces with the hatchet and put it in the bucket. In the dying hours of the day, I tried fishing again. At first, I had no better luck than I had in the morning, but success seemed less elusive. The fish nibbled at the hook with fervor. Their interest was evident. I realized that these were small fish, too small for the hook, so I cast my line further out and let it sink deeper, beyond the reach of the small fish that concentrated around the raft and lifeboat. It was when I used the flying fish's head as bait, and with only one sinker, casting my line out and pulling it in quickly, making the head skim over the surface of the water, that I finally had my first strike. So he kept changing his fishing methods until he found a method that worked. So Pi kept changing his fishing methods until he found a method that worked. This is another way to survive. A Dorado surged forth and lunged for the fish head. I let out a little slack to make sure it had properly swallowed the bait before giving the line a good yank. The Dorado exploded out of the water, tugging on the line so hard I thought it was going to pull me off the raft. I braced myself. The line became very taut. It was good line. It would not break. I started bringing the Dorado in. It struggled with all its might, jumping and diving and splashing. The line cut into my hands. I wrapped my hands in the blanket. My heart was pounding. The fish was as strong as an ox. I was not sure I would be able to pull it in. I noticed all the other fish had vanished from around the raft and boat. No doubt they had sensed the Dorado's distress. I hurried. Its struggling would attract sharks, but it fought like a devil. My arms were aching. Every time I got it close to the raft, it beat about with such frenzy that I was cowed into letting out some line. So he's very timid, but he keeps going and he keeps trying, even though it's painful, even though it's difficult. At last, I managed to haul it aboard. It was over 3 feet long. The bucket was useless. It would fit the Dorado like a hat. I held the fish down by kneeling on it and using my hands. It was a writhing mass of pure muscle, so big its tail struck out from beneath me, pounding hard against the raft. It was giving me a ride like I imagine a bucking bronco would give a cowboy. It was a wild and triumphant mood. I was in a wild and triumphant mood. A Dorado is a magnificent looking fish. large, fleshy, and sleek with a bulging forehead that speaks of a forceful personality, a very long dorsal fin, as proud as a rooster's comb, and a coat of scales that is smooth and bright. I felt I was dealing fate a serious blow by engaging such a handsome adversary. With this fish, I was retaliating against the sea, against the wind, against the sinking of ships, against all circumstances that were working against me. Thank you, Lord Vishnu. Thank you, I shouted. Once you saved the world by taking the form of a fish. Now you have saved me by taking the form of a fish. Thank you. Thank you. So, Pi had a lot against him, wind, sinking ship, and all the other circumstances against him. But now his God has saved him in the form of a fish. Killing it was no problem. I would have spared myself the trouble. After all, it was for Richard Parker, and he would have dispatched it with expert ease, but for the hook that was embedded in its mouth. I exulted at having a Dorado at the end of my line. I would be less keen if it were a tiger. I went about the job in a direct way. I took the hatchet in both my hands and vigorously beat the fish on the head with the hammerhead. I still didn't have the stomach to use the sharp edge. The Dorado did a most extraordinary thing as it died. It began to flash all kinds of colors in rapid succession. Blue, green, red, gold, and violet flickered and shimmered neon-like on its surface as it struggled. I felt I was beating a rainbow to death. I found out later that the Dorado is famed for its death knell iridescence. At last, it lay still and dull-colored, and I could remove the hook. I even managed to retrieve a part of my bait. You may be astonished that in such a short period of time, I could go from weeping over the muffled killing of a flying fish to the gleefully bludgeoning to death a Dorado. I could explain it by arguing that profiting from a pitiful flying fish's navigational mistake made me shy and sorrowful, while the excitement of activity capturing a great Dorado made me singular and self-assured. But in point of fact, the explanation lies elsewhere. It is simple and brutal. A person can get used to anything, even to killing. Let's underline this line. So in order to survive, he had to get used to killing. It was with a hunter's pride that I pulled a raft up to the lifeboat. I brought it along the side, keeping very low. I swung my arm and dropped the Dorado into the boat. It landed with a heavy thud and provoked a gruff expression of surprise from Richard Parker. After a sniff or two, I heard the wet mashing sound of a mouth at work. I pushed myself off, not forgetting to blow the whistle hard several times to remind Richard Parker of who had so graciously provided him with fresh food. So, he's blowing the whistle as a way to tame Richard Parker. I stopped to pick up some biscuits and a can of water, so that's what he has to eat. The 5 remaining flying fish in the locker were dead. I pulled their wings off, throwing them away, and wrapped the fish in the now consecrated fish blanket. By the time I had rinsed myself of blood, cleaned up my fishing gear, put things away, and had my supper, night had come on. A thin layer of clouds masked the stars and the moon, and it was very dark. I was tired, but still excited by the events of the last hours. The feeling of busyness was profoundly satisfying. I hadn't thought at all about my plight or myself. Fishing was surely a better way of passing the time than yarn spinning or playing I Spy. Determined to start again the next day as soon as there was light. I fell asleep, my mind lit up by the chameleon-like flickering of the dying Dorado. So the feeling of busyness helped him take his mind off of his plight, his circumstances. So being busy took his mind off his plate. So this is another way to help a person survive, is to stay busy, to give yourself tasks that will take time and take effort, but that have purpose and that can make you feel like you're doing something to reach a positive end. All right, you will see on page 211 that there are comprehension check questions. These are your quiz questions. Please make sure to answer these in your book right now so that you are ready for the quiz when we have class. Thank you for watching my Zoom video. I will see you in class. Bye-bye.